is for junior high history. We're looking at the highlights from pages 253 to 258. And don't forget also, this is the day that you are to make a video of you reciting the Gettysburg Address and sending that to me. So, page 253, we stopped yesterday with President Johnson, welfare and Vietnam. So highlight his name there, President Johnson. And then find just below his name, next to the picture, the bold term Great Society. And highlight, he called his social reform program the Great Society. And connect that with his name there, and make sure you have President Johnson together with Great Society. That's what you're going to want to know. So Congress began taxing private individuals and businesses and giving the money to local and state governments. So local government became dependent on financial handouts. And really, the welfare movement started with Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s during the Depression. He started a lot of programs. His New Deal was very socialistic. John F. Kennedy was very socialistic. He began more welfare programs, keeping people on the welfare programs. Remember, he had his New Frontier. We saw that yesterday. And now we have Johnson taking welfare even further with his Great Society. So taxes became heavier. Business production slowed down because businesses were losing so much money in taxes. And it was just all in all not a good thing, and welfare is a detriment to any society and any productivity in society. Now, the Vietnam War. Highlight the Vietnam War and just be kind of familiar with it. There's not a whole lot in particular that you actually need to remember about it here. Later history classes will go a little bit more in detail. But the Vietnam War was very terrible, but the worst thing about it is that the men were not allowed to fight to win. I think we mentioned earlier the policy of containment with communism in Asia. And that was the idea here. They didn't want to actually defeat the communists. They just wanted to keep them where they were. And if the men had been allowed to fight to win and the generals had been allowed to do their job, the war would have ended a lot differently. So sadly, a lot of men were killed, many more injured. And you can see the picture there of the memorial in Washington, D.C. And it has names of many of those who lost their lives. Next, we have Nixon, and he started out okay. He did pull the troops out of Vietnam, and that was under pressure from the American people and from a very liberal Congress. And unfortunately, he also wanted to befriend Communist China. So he left the South Vietnamese helpless against the communists. But he did become one of the first presidents to ever set foot in China, and the first president to visit while he was president. Next, we had the Watergate scandal, and the president was involved in a cover-up to keep the American people from knowing about a break-in that occurred at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. And what happened is it was an election year, and they were trying to get information on the other campaign. So it was pretty illegal, and Nixon knew about it and covered it up. So on page 254, highlight that Richard Nixon was the first president ever to resign from office. And then his vice president, Gerald Ford, became president. Not a whole lot to know about him. He wanted to cut back government spending and social welfare, but Congress would not allow it. On page 255, let's look at President Carter. Highlight, the United States gives up the Panama Canal. And then highlight his name there, President Jimmy Carter. It was his fault. Probably one of the worst of the presidents, not gonna lie there. So he gave up the Panama Canal, And in 1979, when the anti-communist Shah of Iran was overthrown, the new government in Iran took hostage 55 Americans from the American embassy. So Carter failed to help the Shah restore the legitimate government, and he did not take any necessary action to secure the release of the hostages. So on the next column, highlight President Carter again. And this was one of his only actual accomplishments in office. Highlight that he was able to get the leader of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat, and the Israeli Prime Minister to agree to a peace treaty. And this was called the Camp David Accords, and it was significant because it was the first time in 2,000 years that the Jews and Arabs had officially talked together peaceably. And that accomplishment is given to Jimmy Carter. He was such a weak pacifist himself. It was not a small thing to get these guys together to talk peace. So you're going to want to know he was able to get the leader of Egypt and the Israeli Prime Minister to agree to a peace treaty. Right, turning the page to page 256. Find Ronald Reagan in bold. Highlight his name. And we went from a terrible, weak president to probably one of the best presidents that we've ever had. When Reagan was elected, within just a few hours of his election, Iran voluntarily released the 55 hostages that they had taken under Jimmy Carter. And that was because they knew that if they did not release those hostages, that Reagan was going to come after them. He was a strong man and a very strong president. So on the second column on page 256, find where it says the Reagan Revolution. Highlight all of these words that are underlined. The attempt to return America to the traditional values of church, family, and free enterprise became known as the Reagan Revolution. So he wanted to cut taxes, he wanted to cut down on the welfare programs, and unfortunately he didn't succeed a whole lot with cutting down the welfare, but he did succeed in cutting taxes. So this has spurred job growth and productivity, and it was very important because when people are taxed too much and when businesses are taxed too much, they don't have enough money to buy things that they need. So when people can't buy things that they need, the businesses can't sell them. When the businesses can't sell their items, they're not making any money. Pretty self-explanatory there. So lower taxes help all Americans. Next, the Reagan Doctrine. Reagan wanted to restore the strength of the U.S. military. There had been kind of two embarrassments with the war in Korea and the war in Vietnam. Neither one of them were actual victories. Neither one of them succeeded in stopping communism. So highlight this. He believed in stopping communism before it could attack and enslave a country, and highlight that this idea became known as the Reagan Doctrine. So this went very much against the containment policy that had been in place for over 30 years. He believed that you needed to attack communism before it could attack and enslave someone else. On page 257, under Defending Traditional Values, highlight that Ronald Reagan appointed 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices. And this was pretty significant. Now, the presidents, of course, have the power to appoint the Supreme Court justices. The key with this is whether the presidents happen to be liberal or conservative. Liberal presidents are going to appoint liberal justices, and their interpretation of the Constitution is usually pretty far off from what the writers of the Constitution actually intended. Conservative presidents tend to appoint more conservative justices, and they tend to interpret the Constitution according to the actual traditional values of the Founding Fathers. So highlight this lady's name. She was one of the justices that Ronald Reagan appointed, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She was the first woman justice ever appointed to the High Court. So pretty significant there. Under space travel, highlight the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after launching from Cape Canaveral, Florida. And then highlight that the explosion of the Challenger slowed down the space program for several years. It's a great tragedy there. And then page 258, our last highlight. Under Frightened Communist, highlight President Reagan visited the city of West Berlin and challenged the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. This is a big challenge there. He set in motion a chain of events, and eventually that wall was torn down, and a lot of that was thanks to Reagan's strong stand. So that's our last highlight for today. Make sure you complete all of your reading, answer your homework questions, and let me know if you have any questions yourself.